Hello, everyone. This is Rick with a Cyber Pro podcast. Industry leaders share their insights because hackers never sleep. So let's get right to it. We have Trevor on. Trevor, I'm going to let you say your last name because I don't want to butcher it, but I know that you're the vice president of Spy Cloud Labs. Talk to us about that and who you are and why you're awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. I appreciate you having me today. So last name is pronounced Hilligoss, although I accept all variations. I've heard Hilligoose and Hilligross and many, many more I won't repeat here. I run Spy Cloud Labs, which is the internal research organization that exists within the greater Spy Cloud organization. So we exist basically to do research on cyber threat actors, collect data, normalize it so that we can actually see what the heck we're looking at, and all other forms of cybersecurity work supporting the greater community.
Love it. And we have some really good bonus questions. So make sure people are tuning in around those. Come back to the main podcast because Trevor's going to talk to us about some cool stuff today. So let's kick it off. What recent evolutions have you noticed in the cybersecurity landscape?
Great question. I think the biggest one that I really go back to is how cybercrime has become a commodity. And what I mean by that is, we used to, going back, let's say 10, 15 years ago, the byword was sophistication. When we talked about how dangerous an adversary was, we often anchored that in a discussion about how sophisticated they were. And not saying that's not true anymore. I mean, there's certainly sophistication does matter, especially if we're talking about, nation state adversaries. But the community, the cyber criminal community, has gotten to the point now where just about everything can be purchased with a couple tenths of or hundredths of a Bitcoin. And what that means for us as sort of the defensive side of this coin is the threats are not only more varied, but there's also a significantly lower bar to entry. So we end up having more adversaries that are employing, a greater variety of tooling, some of which is probably more, the tooling itself is more sophisticated than the adversary may be, for example. So that really diversifies the threats. It changes kind of how I think we should think about the problem and certainly how we can structure our own defenses.
I love it. And I've seen it myself, right? I mean, I'm a Python coder, but I now use ChatGPT to make a quick code script, review to make sure it's right, and then I run it. And so anybody who isn't a coder could do that themselves. So
Yeah. And I mean, to that point, talking a lot about AI, adversaries are using it. Some of them are definitely using it to, research vulnerabilities or, like you said, come up with a quick Python script. They might not be a Python dev, but, you combine what you can get from ChatGPT and maybe a few questions on Stack Overflow, and you can probably come up with something that, it won't be elegant, but, it'll at least run, right?
it'll do the job, most likely. So what are some common misconceptions that you encounter about cybersecurity?
Ooh, that is a good question. I'll try not to repeat my prior answer, but I do think there's a lot of parallels there. I think, you know, I- part of our role being cyber communicators, especially, I like to think about, I think it's Neil deGrasse Tyson. He talks a lot about being a scientific communicator. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you are the smartest person in the room, everything about every subject. Really, at least how I interpret that is you're able to speak to very high level principles to people that don't come from that background, right? So I think as kind of the cybersecurity field, we need to do a very good job about explaining some of these high level principles to people that don't, live and breathe this life every single day. And I live this myself. I get off on a tear about talking about, info stealers or loader malware. I assume that everybody that's listening knows exactly what I'm talking about. When in reality, probably single digits percentage of the public kind of gets my train of thought, maybe even less than that, because it is quite niche, right? So I think it's impingent upon it's relies on ourselves, big words, to really tailor our message and focus on understanding, and not sounding cool or smart or making the buzzwords even more buzzy, Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I think our job as defensive focused cybersecurity professionals is to make sure that we can do the best that we can do to prevent the adversaries from being successful, right? Whether that's disincentivizing it from the law enforcement perspective or the regulatory perspective, or just making it a lot harder for them, and that's going to pay dividends. But it will only pay dividends if people that don't speak cyber actually grok what we're saying, because oftentimes they're the ones that are going to sign the check, right?
Yeah, I once heard somebody say the only way to truly protect your data is to make all data public. And I was like, that's never going to happen. So let's work through that. And so that gives me kind of this next question for you, which is kind of that positive, here's something you should take forward. And so, what do you feel is a critical aspect of growing a robust cyber strategy for almost all organizations?
Ooh, yeah. So I'm gonna say something that I've said for a long time, and I've gotten a lot of pushback on it, but I'll say it anyway. If you run security for an organization, it's not if you'll be impacted by a cyber event, it's when. I think we all kind of have this hero complex that, yeah, it's happening to the other guys. It'll never happen to me. I'm the best. We have the best tooling. We have the best personnel. You can have all of those things. You can be the best at your job. You can know all there is to know, and you can still get punched in the mouth, and you will. So I think what I would say to that is knowledge is power. Certainly invest in defensive techniques. Certainly do all of the vulnerability scanning and the patching and all of the good, implement MFA, all the things that we hear on LinkedIn or read on LinkedIn, every day of the week from all of these talking heads. Do those things. That's great advice, but always have a plan for when all of that advice fails. And that's where knowledge comes in, right? The only thing worse than having an event happen on a Friday at 4 p.m. is not knowing that an event happened at Friday on a 4 p.m., right? That is infinitely worse because the adversary was successful. You just didn't know. So definitely, plan for that. Have ways to detect when that happens. And honestly, it might not be any detection inside of your network. It probably won't be. Your detection missed it. That's why the event happened. But don't just kind of do the hear no evil, see no evil, and expect it. It's not going to happen. Probably already did. You just didn't know about it.
So I take that even one step further, right? I talk a lot about how what you just defined is really resilience, right? It's building a resilient business, not just a stack of technology or services. And so taking that forward, you have this in your mind. I just added the word resilient, but take that forward and share a cool or compelling kind of real world cyber story about how you promote resilience and the lessons you've learned from it.
So I'm gonna turn that at about 45 degrees there, Rick. But I'll take that as a seed. I promise this won't be a politician's answer. So back in July, Chrome released app-based encryption for session cookies, right, or for cookies in general. And this was explicitly to prevent against session hijacking, which is basically where criminals will use malware that's able to acquire cookies from a browser, and then they'll pass those cookies as valid means of authentication to get recognized by whatever they're trying to get into, and then move typically laterally from there. That lasted about 45 days. There was about 45 days based on our research where criminals were kind of trying to, rejigger their tooling and come with an answer to it. After that, as of today, and I guess a couple months ago now, pretty much every commodity malware that's out there, every info stealer has ways to get around that. And, obviously that's not like, ooh, cool. At least not from most people's perspectives. I tend to think it's cool, but I'm a little weird like that. The reason I mention that is because I think what's really, really critical for us to understand is the criminals are infinitely malleable, right? What is it? There's like a Marine saying, Semper Gumby or something like that. Always be flexible, right? The criminals are the most flexible. They're the most incentivized to be flexible because that's their job, right? Our job is to make their lives harder. Their job is to beat us. So for everything that we do, there's going to be a period where hopefully it's successful, but highly likely that there's going to be some answer. And whether that's going to be either another vulnerability that's identified or a workaround to an existing fix or something else, we need to enter these with the understanding that it's going to be a constant battle. There will always be this seesaw between the things that we do and the counters that the criminal or the threat actor does. And we need to just understand that we're going to need to respond again. We're not going to no fix is permanent on the internet. It just, I mean, at least none that I have seen. Perhaps it exists, but I certainly haven't seen that.
I mean, the only fix is just not to go on the internet, but I don't know if that's a positive.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah. So Trevor, thank you for being on the show. I got one final question for you. What's your favorite piece of retro technology that makes you smile?
Oh, geez. My mind goes to about a year ago, I got my son a emulator that will basically run any 8-bit game. And this isn't the emulator obviously is not retro. Of course, it looks retro, right? Whoever designed the 3D printer model made it look retro. But my mind goes to that because my son is 10, so he's quite young, but he's in that age where everything is cool if it's a game, right? And it's neat seeing him get into programming, and a lot of it is kind of drag and drop programming, but it's still logic and understanding some pretty high level things from the perspective of this is cool. I can do this. I can write some code on my Mac, and then I can upload it to this little box that I can hold in my hand, and then I can play what I built. And I think that kind of mirrors what I see in him is kind of what I experienced as a nerd in the 90s and kind of fiddling around with things on my own self. Obviously, it's a little bit different nowadays, but I think it's really cool that there's still these things that exist that will give a similar experience to the younger generations as we kind of move forward into this everything is AI age.
I love it. Trevor, thank you for being on the Cyber Pro podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning into the Cyber Pro podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on new podcasts and all of our cool bonus content.